Good afternoon to everyone. I would like to welcome Nancy Mujo Baker Washi, our guest teacher this morning. Nancy is a Zen teacher in the White Plum Asanga. She's also a Dharma heir of Bernie Glassman and founded the No Traces Zendo or Sangha in New York City. She began Zen practice in 1979 with Nakajima Sensei, a Soto priest. Nancy is a native of Chicago who earned degrees at Wellesley College and Brandeis University. She's a professor of philosophy at Sarah Lawrence College. So I'd like to welcome Nancy and also the rest of your community who is joining us this morning.
Thank you, Helen. I'm very, very happy to be here. And also happy to be retired, which you didn't mention. So, as some of you may know, I know Helen knows because she read one of them, but I, by accident, ended up with some Dharma talks about the precepts being printed by Tricycle magazine. And this was a few years ago when I somehow came across one of them that had been transcribed. And then again, by accident, it's now turning into a book, which Shambhala will publish. And I think, well, I guess I should say right off that my master is Dogen. And the precepts that the 10 grave precepts and the 3 pure precepts that get studied in the lineage of Maizumi Roshi, and which your lineage is connected to, I know, or it's the 10 precepts that are studied and practiced. And so in addition to killing, lying, stealing, sexual misconduct, intoxication, which are the 5 that I think you are studying, there is not speaking ill of others' faults, not blaming and elevating oneself, not being stingy, not being angry, and not, and here there are many odd translations, not abusing the 3 treasures. What's interesting about the Dogen precepts, as they're called, that have come down to us is that it's not a question of not or don't, but they come down to us as non-killing, non-lying, stealing, etc. And, you know, it's sort of quickly, and I think somewhat superficially, is presented to us as, was presented to us as sort of 3 ways of looking at the precepts. That one was the sort of absolute in the ordinary sense of absolute, never, ever, ever lie, steal, whatever. And the second was a sort of contextual, relative way that, you know, took into account that maybe Robin Hood's context made stealing okay. And then the third being the absolute, you know, somehow when you're in the absolute, there is no stealing, lying, killing, etc. Well, I don't know, that just wasn't satisfactory for this philosophy type. And so I've spent a lot of time really understanding Dogen, and experientially and sort of philosophically. I mean, he was one of what I consider to be the 3 or 4 great philosopher mystics in the history of the universe. He said, when we sit zazen, what precept is not observed, what merit is not actualized? And of course, he didn't mean just sitting on the cushion, but rather the zazen that we take into life. And I thought the title of the book should be, we'll see what Shambhala says, but Opening to Oneness with the Zen Precepts. And so that, in the history of the religious traditions, oneness can mean many different things. And I think what's really striking about Dogen is that in the history of Zen, when we get to Dogen in the 13th century, it's suddenly the particulars of this world that we live in matter. I mean, he tells us that you want to know what Buddha nature is? Well, a horse's mouth and a donkey's jaw, raindrop, etc. But the oneness here, which includes other human beings and thus includes the precepts, is not just interconnectedness, but actually interpenetration. So it's as if one particular, and this comes out of the influence of something called Huayan Buddhism in him, for him. But it's that to become one with something, which happens in Zen retreats, the experience, it's actually to interpenetrate something, not to just mergy, mushy, disappear into whatever, but he points out that somehow that the absolute particularity of something, which then, to make this possible, it has to be not conceptual, so it has no boundaries. And that, so we find running throughout the Zen tradition that a goal, if you will, is to experience, to live non-hindrance or non-obstruction. So in the case of the precepts, I think the secret to understanding the precepts from his point of view is to study them along with his commentary and the commentary from Bodhidharma, whether it's actually, we know it's up in the air whether Bodhidharma actually existed, but they're called the one mind precepts of Bodhidharma. So when we practice the precepts at the beginning, at the level of not, I'm here and the precept is over there. And the precept is something that I observe, or I follow, or I fail to follow. So there's separation between me and the precept. So that's not, that's don't. But when we get to non, it's that whatever it is just doesn't happen. There's not even the temptation to lie or steal. How could what is there to steal if I am everything? Or if there's no particular me that experiences lack, why should I steal? There's no such thing. And this is very much like, I think, Augustine's love God and do what you will. That to truly love God is really the issue. And in Zen, to truly experience and know the oneness of being is truly the issue. So the separation, so I'm here and the precept is there, there's separation. And what I want is oneness. I want to be the precept. I want to become non-killing. But the other separation is between me and stealing, lying, being angry, gossiping, etc. So the only way to follow the precept is in some sense to suppress what the precept is urging us not to do. And so in doing that, I'm really sort of splitting off part of myself or disowning part of myself. And we know that, Zen practice urges us not to do that. I mean, when I do that, I end up being this particular bounded thing, aspect of myself that excludes other aspects of myself that I don't like. or are too painful to allow or befriend or have compassion for, or become one with, to embrace, to welcome my anger, greed, my ignorance. Um, so the only way I can be one with a precept or with the glass of water that I have here and that I'm about to drink is by being 100% myself. It's a kind of samadhi state, a kind of, nothing is sort of excluded when that happens. And so there are two wonderful quotes from Dogen, which I'll read. But what I came to realize, and is very much part of how I have practiced the precepts with my group, is we learn to befriend all those aspects of ourselves that the precepts say are not good. First of all, they increase separation. They're not compassionate, so on and so forth. So we've developed a way of working with a partner or with a group where you answer questions like, tell me a way that you steal. And so it's to get to know the stealer, the thief in me, and then is bad enough to allow it that is what I am. But to actually be able to do that in the presence of others is very important, and it takes courage. But doing it has a remarkable effect. The closer, so take something like anger. Let's say I'm an angry person. This is the 9th precept. Say I'm an angry person, or I think of myself as being an angry person, or everybody else thinks of me as an angry person. It means that I'm easily triggered, reactive, and the anger gets out. It gets expressed, gets acted on. But the other side of that coin is some people stuff it. So I'm not angry, not me, and the idea of being angry is really kind of scary. I have a wonderful friend who's my age, and years ago, when she was working a couple of hours away from New York City, and she was in analysis, and it involved a train commute, and she stayed overnight with me on Thursday night. So she had a session then, and then she had another session Friday morning, and then she'd take the train back. So years later, we were having Thanksgiving, and I said, Robbie, what was your analysis about? And she thought for a minute. She said, anger. And she doesn't strike me as an angry person at all, but I think it was the stuffing type. And I said, what about it? And she thought for a minute, and she said, I was afraid I'd blow up. Notice that language. It's like literally, existentially blow up. And there's an existential fear in that case of really being in touch with my anger. It isn't just that I'm afraid I'm going to blow up at my parents or whoever. So it does take courage in many cases to really allow these parts of ourselves that we would rather not deal with. But what happens when we do get curious, in this case, to stick with the example of anger, it's as if it either goes out or it goes in. I mean, it goes down, hidden in the basement, but it's right here that we should be interested. Be curious about what is it like, independently of the object of my anger, you, or the cause of my anger, you just broke my beautiful vase, but to be, what is anger? And to get closer and closer to that, it starts not having boundaries. It starts actually transforming itself. And, I think the Tantric Buddhism as practiced in Tibetan Buddhism with the Buddha families and so on, they have a language of the poison of anger is the poison. And the same energy, when the anger is released from my refusal, is clarity. And I've always been struck by sharp tongue, sharp mind. You can see it's a similar energy, but one is freed and one is still trapped. So here are the quotes from Dogen. And this is one that's occurred elsewhere in the Zen tradition, but he uses it in a particular way, which is not worth going into right now. It's too hard. He's very difficult, as I'm sure most of you know. If you fall down because of the ground, you must use the ground to get up. If you try to get up without the ground, it makes no sense. Namely, we have to use the stealer in us to arrive at the place of non-stealing. And here's the other wonderful quote. When a demon becomes a Buddha, namely, this is how it becomes a Buddha. It exerts its demonness, breaks it, and actualizes a Buddha. When a Buddha becomes a Buddha, and notice for him, Buddha nature is not something out there independent of us. It happens, you might say, when we experience it. So even a Buddha becomes a Buddha. Buddha nature is impermanent, and impermanence is Buddha nature for Dogen. So when a Buddha becomes a Buddha, he or she exerts his or her Buddhahood, strives for it, and actualizes a Buddha. When a human being becomes a Buddha, she exerts his or her human nature, trains it, and actualizes a Buddha. You should thoroughly understand the truth that possibilities for actualizing a Buddha lie precisely in the ways various human beings exert their respective natures. So in the case of stealing or anger, it's my being completely open to understanding it and discovering it, that in the case of the language with the demon, it breaks it, and there's a liberation that happens. And, it does take courage in the beginning, especially. And I found this wonderful anonymous quote recently that says, "The will of God will never take you to where the grace of God will not protect you." And I think that's where the role of faith happens in the Zen tradition. That we learn, it isn't that we have faith in this as opposed to that, it's, which is true, I think, in all traditions, that true faith is a question of a way of being. And it's when I open to what's painful, what's difficult, my teacher, Bernie Glassman, as I'm sure some of you know, would take people into true homelessness, have them experience what it's like to be homeless in winter, for example. And he had his retreats at Auschwitz, and so for him, he called these plunges, and it was about coming face to face, in this case not with parts of myself I don't want to deal with, but with parts of society, parts of human condition that I don't want to deal with. And somehow that coming face to face turns out to be liberating in a very surprising way, both about ourselves and about the world. I remember I did the retreat at Auschwitz, which is, he has a little book about it, which is wonderful to read. And it's, 5-6 days of sitting on the selection site in November. It's cold, and the only lunch, the lunch that we had was exactly what the inmates had. There was a little bit of thin soup and a piece of bread. And, and then you see these horrible things. I mean, then you hear, you go into the ovens and it's just, as my friend and Dharma holder, Kataiji, who's here somewhere, said when he came back, the mind can't take it in. But I remember leaving that retreat, and other people have had this experience, that every blade of grass was made of love. So it was so surprising. And this same thing happens when we really keep visiting these parts of ourselves that we don't like, that have, in this case, to do with the precepts. Now, in order to be 100%, allow 100%, welcome 100%, the liar, the stealer, etc. in me, I can't leave anything out. So one of the things that I did was to consider and welcome anybody studying the precepts to consider, take stealing, all the meanings that stealing could have. We usually think of it in some literal way as stealing other people's property, taking what's not ours. But think about stealing attention, or stealing electricity, or, when I remember when I was teaching at Sarah Lawrence, learning to flick the light switch off when I left the room. And I had to really learn it. I had to train myself. But then much later, thinking about the precepts, I thought, I'm just stealing from everybody else if I fail to do that, if I fail to pick up bottles and papers on my street, or if I harm the environment in some way. We now know that I'm literally harming Mother Earth. I'm harming Gaia that, has had for millennia the possibility of self-repair, but we may be pushing it beyond its capacity if we're not careful. But I remember in the 80s and 90s, it wasn't that I'm literally hurting the earth. It's that I'm hurting the beauty of something for other people, or I'm taking water from other people, or I'm cleaning water from other people, et cetera, et cetera. So that, so there are many ways of thinking about that kind of stealing. So I should have made a list of all the things I had thought of and that are in these essays, these talks. But, I think an important thing to do is to use your own imagination, because just spread it out, and lying, lying, unfortunately, we're living through a time in our own culture where lying is sort of so rampant, we've lost sight of what not lying is, or non-lying. But we lie to ourselves. We steal from ourselves. We steal health. It's amazing what you can do with these precepts. So it works. And eventually, because of that taking in, all just suddenly you start, especially working with a partner, what I've discovered, and everybody in the group has discovered, that even though in the beginning of starting to do this takes some courage, I have trouble acknowledging that I'm whatever. I'm certainly not going to do it in privacy. I'm certainly not going to do it in the presence of someone else. But it becomes very freeing. And the freer you become with something like that, the more naturally the precept expresses itself, as opposed to being something that I use to suppress or to control my behavior. So I'm opening it up to you all. So questions, comments, anything. And Helen, I'm not sure how to do this. Maybe you, people raise their hands, you can call on them.
First of all, Nancy, I'd like to thank you so much for being present to us today.
Who is that?
This is Ruben Abito.
Ben,
I'm
I'm
sorry
so
I'm
happy
late.
to meet you.
I'm sorry I'm late. I had some school commitments, but I'm glad I made it. And I'd like to really thank you for taking time to share with us your wisdom. I feel that you have taken us to the heart of Zen itself in the way you described how to live the precepts in the light of that basic realization of non-separation between myself and the world, the universe.
Yes.
And I have been, so as you know, and as Helen told you, we have been studying the precepts in a methodical way. I hope we have been at least helpful to those who are joining, be able to understand it, not so much as a do's and don'ts kind of thing that precisely, as you said, separates us. If we see it in that way, then there's a part of me that wants to do this because I feel self-righteous in doing this, and if I don't, then I feel bad about myself and so on. So the precepts can be taken in a way that can really split us and be counter to what Zen is all about. And
Yes.
what you then suggested is really to see that interpenetration between myself and everything else. And
Yes.
in that regard, the question is then how, really, it's a question of how to get to that place and how to lead people there without talking from that place as if it were in an elevated spot and then everybody just gazes at it in awe and not knowing what to make of it. So would you help us by offering some guidelines as to how you lead your students to that place that you just described? So we, especially for those, there are many who are beginning and they're really feeling attracted to this practice because they know that it's something that can really open them up and blow their minds. And so how would you lead people to that place that you described by the hand in entering the world that you described?
I'm glad you asked that because I think by the hand is really what it is. And I have come to see that, I remember Bernie used to say, we all know this, but then of course we say, well, I don't know this. But in the sense of having a glimpse of something in our daily lives. And the problem is that we pass over it. So there are these interesting moments like being moved to tears by something. And, I remember years ago reading that the biochemistry of those tears is different from the biochemistry of, anger tears or self-pity tears or whatever. And so what happens if I'm surprised, moved by something, but I quickly move beyond it to wonder what's done that. So there are two other examples that I think are excellent ones that I owe the recognition of this to Francis Lucille, who's a wonderful Advaita teacher. And one is getting a joke. That the very moment of getting the joke, we're not aware of at all. We just, the laughter that follows it is really the thing. And then maybe even having to explain it to, what at that time I might consider a dense person, which I am sometimes, in not getting something. And the same with suddenly understanding something, that moment of suddenly seeing something. And what's happened then, and of course this comes, I think, closer to the Zen experience of realization, is that I have moved into another level, another realm, as it were. So instead of, we're always told you can't treat Zazen as a means to an end. You can't have a gaining idea. You can't look for the Buddha out there and so on and so forth, because it acts as a barrier. But the more I'm able to be this here, just sitting, whatever it is, working on a koan, something, giving up all, it's the grace of God. It suddenly happens to me. So we hear about this, we read about this and so on, but I think every beginner can just contemplate that experience of suddenly understanding something in ordinary life. I have a example that's very extreme in my life, ordinary life, which is I used to live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I would, or even when I lived in New York, I would spend time on Cape Cod. And when I lived here, I would go for my March so-called spring break. And on Cape Cod, there's as some of you may know, there's a highway that goes out that at one place is one way both ways. So, and there's nothing really serious dividing these two ways. So there are these big signs that say, headlights on in daytime for safety. And I swear I spent 20 years wondering how the hell putting my headlights on is going to make me safer. And then one day it hit me. It was about the other guy being able to see my car. And I tell you, I laughed and laughed. I mean, it was a real Zen moment. So that's one way I think that one can take people by the hand. The other that I've really, and in a sense, I owe this to Bernie, but I think it came out of the academic in me as well, who taught in a small liberal arts college that was very oriented towards teaching and understanding the particular nature of each student instead of imposing some. And that is working with partners or working in group. And, Bernie and now, many teachers in the White Plum Sangha use the Native American way of the council. And, to have a circle, and I've used it at the end of retreats where I will ask a question and there's a talking stick and the talking stick is passed around. And there's no crosstalk, and crosstalk includes even nodding and smiling, to somebody else. And it's sort of like the mind of Zazen, that there are these gaps, these moments, and then something comes up in the speaker, and then it goes on to the next person and so on. Well, this too, at first, is anxiety producing. And the real trick is not to rehearse. And so I think that that somehow there's group work that Zen needs more of, because it helps break down those barriers that are always up, in promoting, self-promoting or self-protecting, and enable a kind of openness, a kind of relaxation that happens, so that even can happen with sitting. And then that too can increase one's focus. One isn't so distracted by. So I don't know, this is a woman teacher from a certain generation, but my academic life was in this college. I taught no more than 2 courses. They lasted a whole year, no more than 15 in a class, a round table, and each student had a one-on-one with the teacher every other week. So there was, at first, people are nervous, they want to show off or don't show off and so on. And as time goes on, the whole class just sort of opens up. And, actually, I for many years, I taught a course called Language and Religious Experience. And one of the books we read, which is a very difficult but extraordinary book, is by someone named Michael Sells, and it's called The Mystical Languages of Unsaying. And it's about the Western tradition, so that, the Zen tradition sort of goes vertically with the teacher and the student and becomes the teacher and so on. And the Western tradition is a lot of it is in writing, and he shows how there's you can't say, but you can't say that you can't say. So there's some way that reading disorients the mind. And so it sort of breaks open the possibility of the grace of God entering. And so I'm in this class one day, and the book is also written, I think, in this spirit. It's quite an extraordinary book. And something happened in the class. And I didn't, I just went right on. I mean, I don't think I even noticed it. But after that class, when I started having my one-on-one meetings with individual students, each one of them came in and said, "What happened in class?" And then I realized that something did happen. Namely, I allowed my own mind to go back and acknowledge. So it was a kind of group effort that made the whole group fall into a shared silence. And that kind of passing something over like that is no different from my passing over the moment of getting a joke. Mm-hmm. The moment of getting a joke is out of time. I can't grasp it conceptually. I can't describe it to you, but I can be aware that something like that happened.
Thank you. I think that that's a very important guide as to what Zen is all about. I'd like to open the floor for others, but one last comment just to affirm what you said, that Zen is not a methodical approach where you go and take a process and therefore you arrive at a conclusion, but simply a preparation for that aha moment when everything changes. And that's really what we're all about. When that happens, then we see the world in a totally different light. And as you said, the whole, every single blade of grass is just reeking of love.